is more applicable to all of the issues of a needy church than any other. The book of Romans is slightly longer, but about 80% of it's doctrinal on the subject of salvation. So 1 Corinthians really represents a special book. Before we start another extended study, I want for us to spend a couple of weeks rolling around some ideas. And I want to explore a little this evening, and we're going to do it in the Old Testament. And I want you to read with me from 1 Chronicles chapter 13. I'll give you a minute to get there. 1 Chronicles 13. And we will read all of this chapter and a little bit from a couple of others. And then I've got some observations that I'd like to make about this material. 1 Chronicles 13:1. Then David consulted with the captains of thousands and hundreds, and with every leader. And David said to all the assembly of Israel, "If it seems good to you, and if it is of the Lord our God, let us send out to our brethren everywhere who are left in all the land of Israel, and with them to the priests and Levites who are in their cities and their common lands, that they may gather together to us. And let us bring the ark of our God back to us, for we have not inquired at it since the days of Saul." Then all the assembly said that they would do so, for the thing was right in the eyes of all the people. So David gathered all Israel together from Shihor in Egypt to as far as the entrance of Hamath, to bring the ark of God from Kirjath-jearim. And David and all Israel went up to Baalah, to Kirjath-jearim, which belongs to Judah, to bring up from there the ark of God, the ark of God the Lord, who dwells between the cherubim, where his name is proclaimed. So they carried the ark of God on a new cart from the house of Abinadab, and Uzzah and Ahio drove the cart. Then David and all Israel played before God with all their might, with singing on harps, on stringed instruments, on tambourines, on cymbals, and with trumpets. And when it came to Kedon's threshing floor, Uzzah put out his hand to hold the ark, for the oxen stumbled. Then the anger of the Lord was aroused against Uzzah, and he struck him, because he put his hand to the ark, and he died there before God. And David became angry because of the Lord's outbreak against Uzzah. Therefore that place is called Perez Uzzah to this day. David was afraid of God that day, saying, "How can I bring the ark of God to me?" So David would not move the ark with him into the city of David, but took it aside into the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. The ark of God remained with the family of Obed-Edom in his house 3 months, and the Lord blessed the house of Obed-Edom and all that he had. Drop down to the next chapter, 14, and we'll start reading at verse 8, just a couple of verses. Now when the Philistines heard that David had been anointed king over all Israel, all the Philistines went up to search for David. And David heard of it, and went out against them. Then the Philistines went and made a raid on the valley of Rephaim. And David inquired of God, saying, "Shall I go up against the Philistines? Will you deliver them into my hand?" The Lord said to him, "Go up, for I will deliver them into your hand." And we'll do a little more reading in a moment, but let's stop there for now. The book of Romans, chapter 15, verse 4, says that the things that were written before or aforetime were written for our learning. Now, when Paul wrote that to the Roman church, he was describing that which applied to them, to the his modern church. He was saying that the things of the Old Testament were written for Christians, that we should learn from, that we might have patience and hope, a knowledge of the Scriptures. That concept is important. The Old Testament is not here just as an addendum to our New Testament Bible, but rather much of what we understand about God's relationship with people, is discovered by God's interaction with the children of Israel. Much of what we have in the New Testament, in the discussion of Jesus and the Gospels, and then the application to the church, would not have the meaning that it does if we did not understand all of the events that had taken place in the Old Testament. God's relationship with this people, His covenant, His expectations, His demands, the law that they were living under. And when Jesus comes and gives what starts in Matthew chapter 5, that we describe as the Sermon on the Mount, when He starts talking about their understanding of the law, their application of the law into their lives, He is addressing Himself to the failures that they had in complying with the laws of God, and further expectations that Jesus had in making themselves purer, more righteous. And He was going to establish a new covenant, but it was based on the old covenant. Now, let's notice some factors about the events that we read a while ago in 1 Chronicles chapter 13. First of all, verse 1, David consulted with the captains of thousands, hundreds, with every leader. David consulted with all of his leadership. Is that a good move or a bad one? Generally speaking, good. If a king does not have willing subjects, he can rule as a tyrant. But generally speaking, the concept of consensus is the best way to move forward with ideas. Now, it's not necessarily the most efficient way. There are times when you simply cannot come to a consensus in all things. But when you can, when that's possible, that means all parties agree. And as a rule, that's a good thing. So David does not strike out on his own and give an edict from the bench and say, here's what we're going to do. Rather, he consults with the people, his leadership, and says, what do you think about this idea? Now, that doesn't take away anything from David's leadership or his authority or his power. It just shows his willingness to draw other people into the process. So he says, what do you think about this idea? And he lays it out for them, and everyone is in agreement with it. His plan involved a couple of things. Number one, it involved the recovery of the people who were scattered around the land. In verse 2, it says, let's reach out to all of those who have been displaced. And David comes on to the throne into a broken throne. Saul led Israel, but there were many troubles in Israel under Saul's leadership. And there was some scattering that was done. And the Philistines that had brought about the defeat of Saul had caused some troubles, and they were stronger, and David now is going to be strengthening the empire. So he's going to draw these people back. And his second move is that he's going to try to bring back the ark of God. And again, verse 4, all the assembly said that they would do so, for the thing was right in the eyes of all the people. Now that's a significant statement. Here they are, the king has laid out his plan, and how did the people respond to him? In the eyes of the people, this was a good thing. Now, is there any hint of coming disaster in that statement? David's got a plan. He shows it to his leadership. They sign off on it. He tells all the people about it. The people feel like this is a good idea. And then we have that statement in verse 4. Everybody involved, the people say, this is a good idea. And it was. It was a good idea. Bring back the ark. Bring back all the stranded folks and regather them together in Israel. But there's going to be a flaw in the plan. It's not the plan that's a problem. It's going to be the execution of it that is going to be the difficulty. Now, when we look at verse 5 and 6, David gathered all of Israel together, describes the extent. They're going to bring back the ark, and they are going to where they are. So this is a huge outpouring. It's hard probably for us to appreciate just how big a deal this was. This was a national movement. This would have involved thousands of people. In fact, the parallel account in 2 Samuel chapter 6 says that 30,000 of David's, I'm assuming military men, went on this trip. Just think about that. If that doesn't include all of the other people there together, 30,000 folks. Have you ever seen 30,000 folks together to do anything? And here they are on foot. They're traveling up to reclaim the ark. So this is a national holiday. It's a trek. And it's not going to be a one-day event. They're not walking outside of Jerusalem to Bethany or Bethlehem. This is going to be a trek off for a long distance. All right. They come to the place that they need to be. They recover the ark. Verse 7. It says, they carried the ark of God on a new cart from the house of Abinadab. And Uzzah and Ahio are driving. All right, so they successfully load the cart with the ark, a new cart. And off they go. Verse 8 says, David and all Israel played before God. Some translations have played music before God. They're singing. They've got their musical instruments going. This is a parade. You got the band there. You've got the Ark of God on the cart. You've got all the people. This is a national parade. They're having a party. They are having a great time. You nearly need that song in the background going right here. I feel good. Because they're feeling good. You know, they're on their way home. They've got the ark, and this is good. They're bringing God back. And bringing God home. It's personal. It's religious. It's popular. They feel good about it. They're having a good time. They're all involved. What you're observing is a huge, man-ordained religious party. And it's possible that they've never felt this way before. This is an unusual experience. This is an accomplishment for them. They feel close to God. They feel close to David. They have national pride here. They're involved with all of this. So what are we missing? What's not here? Well, number one, it's what not here is there's no humility. This is a proud group. They have sanctioned an activity and they are moving toward it with all of their might. Second thing that's not here, and I'm plugging this in from reading between the lines, but I think I can defend it from in a discussion standpoint. What's missing is reverence. And the concept of reverence does not just mean quiet. It means aware of one's place in the presence of greatness, a greater power, a great influence. And I don't see this in this place. Now, perhaps you could argue that David gathering the new cart was reverential, that David gathering all the people together was reverential. But it looks more to me like we're bringing God home in a box on a cart. And there's no fear of God. There's no concern about God as God. a third thing that's missing from this group is obedience. And that's going to come out. They are doing something which they have not been authorized to do, haven't been asked to do. And if you noticed, and the reason why I read from 1 Chronicles chapter 14 after we did this, when David got ready to go off to war, what did he do? He asked God whether it was going to be successful. He wanted to know. When his skin was on the line, he wanted to know, am I going to go up here and get defeated, or is this going to be successful? But David doesn't even consider asking the Lord about bringing the Ark of the Covenant back. Now, in his statement to the leaders, he said, if this is from God, then we'll accomplish this. There's kind of an assumption this is from God. We're not asking. And it's certainly clear that David wasn't thinking about all of the things that were going on. Now, I want to make an observation here before we go farther. Did God specifically state anywhere in the Old Testament not to move the ark on a cart? Is there a statement in the Old Testament that says, thou shalt not move the Ark of the Covenant on a cart? Is there a verse like that anywhere in the Bible? No, there's not. And I know what you're dying to say as I've asked that question. You're going to say, well, yes, but he said how to move it with the Levites, so yes, that means that no, God did not specifically tell them not to do what they're doing presently. That's important. We'll make that connection to its importance in a few minutes. Why that's important is going to come out in our modern discussion much more than in the past. Now, let's continue. Verse 9. They came to this threshing floor. And if you look at the comparison in 2 Samuel and 1 Chronicles, you will notice that the name of the threshing floor is not the same. Let me help you a little bit with that. I'm not sure I can solve it completely. But it appears from the text that what's being described is the name of a person and a location. And some translations have incorrectly, I think, possibly made it, especially in 2 Samuel, the threshing floor description there, and there's a name, looks like it's a personal name, that it belongs to someone. And the one in 2 Chronicles looks like it's a place name. And so when it says the threshing floor of, rather than it's being translated there as a possession, it may be descriptive of the location. So you could have, for example, a field out here that belongs to one of the local people, and you could describe it as the field of so-and-so and call his name and be descriptive of it. You could also say, if there was only one of them, and it was well known from a community standpoint, it is the field of something else and describe a location. And so it would be accurate in both cases. Some have suggested that these are two names for the same guy. I don't know that is the case, but I think that one of them definitely could be a name and one of them a place. They came to this threshing floor. The oxen stumble, and Uzzah sticks out his hand. And something happens. He's struck dead on the spot. And all of us, let me rephrase that. Most of us, at some point in life, have read through here and said, that's not fair. Uzzah should not have been struck dead for trying to keep the ark of God from falling off the cart onto the ground. I hate to bring up the same thing over and over again, but we draw from what we know. On the subject of flying and accidents, there's often description of what we describe as a chain of events that leads to a problem. It applies in other settings as well, but It's a real big topic in aviation. That a decision leads to another decision, which leads to another decision, which leads to another decision. And it's that last one where the accident occurs. But the real problem is that you've boxed yourself in because of other decisions that led up to it. And it's called the chain, or the accident chain, the chain of events. And so there's a lot of discussion about trying to prevent accidents by what is called breaking the chain. And here's a chain of events that begin. And we can put perhaps blame for this at several different levels. We could take it all the way back to David. If David had consulted with God prior to going on this event might not have occurred. Perhaps God would have given him instruction regarding it, or reminding, or whatever, but that's a possibility. Second is, if David had followed the instructions regarding the taking care of the ark of God, this wouldn't have occurred. If they hadn't have put this ark on a cart, if it had been carried the way it was supposed to by people, this event wouldn't have occurred. If Uzzah had not been riding on the cart with the ark, we could go on and say there's several links in this chain that led up to this event. But when we get there, all we say is God shouldn't have struck Uzzah dead for trying to do a good deed. But Uzzah is dead. Verse 10 says, the anger of the Lord was aroused against Uzzah, and he struck him because he put his hand to the ark, and he died there before God. Let's go do a little reading from a couple of other places. Back to the book of Numbers, chapter 4. Numbers chapter 4. Let's It's hard to figure out where to start in this, because we're talking about all of this is the Levitical duties and what they're going to do. Let's start in verse 12. That's not very far back, but understand we're in the middle. Then they shall take all the utensils of service with which they minister in the sanctuary, put them in a blue cloth, cover them with a covering of badger skins, and put them on a carrying beam. Also they shall take away the ashes from the altar and spread a purple cloth over it. Then they shall put on it all of its implements which they ministered there, the fire pans, the forks, the shovels, the basins, all the utensils of the altar. And they shall spread on it a covering of badger skins and insert its poles. And when Aaron and his sons have finished covering the sanctuary and all the furnishings of the sanctuary, when the camp is set to go, then the sons of Kohath shall come to carry them. But they shall not touch any holy thing, lest they die. These are the things in the tabernacle of meeting which the sons of Kohath are to carry. Now, we could back up from there, but that's enough to get us in our discussion. And we have two layers of security here for the things that belong to God. Number one, the only people who are sanctioned to handle these objects that are used in the worship of God are the Levites themselves, the sons of Aaron. They're the only ones. Now, they're going to prepare these things for transport, which is what this chapter is all about. How are you going to carry the things of God when it's time to move them from one place to another? Of course, you know the tabernacle was temporary. It was a tent. It was designed to be mobile. And so it had to be moved. Well, how do you move it? Well, the Levites put everything in place, packaged it up, wrapped it in badger skins for almost everything, and put it on special poles so that another tribe, the Kohathites, could come in, and they're the ones that are actually supposed to carry it. Now, they're the only ones in the children of Israel that are given authority to tote, if you will, the things of God. The Levites are not actually going to do that. They just prepare the wrapping, and then these others come in, and they do the lifting and the hauling, and then when it gets to the other end, they're unwrapped again by the Levites. Even the Kohathites, who are going to do the transport, they are not permitted, although they're the only ones sanctioned to carry these belongings of God. They can't touch the actual items that belong to the service of God. That is strictly the work of the Levites. And so you got Uzzah up there. And they've got the Ark of God, and it's open. It's exposed. Now, the fact that they weren't struck dead putting it up on the cart would indicate to me that they at least used the poles appropriately when they placed the Ark of the Lord up on that cart, or they would have all been struck dead. But now they're riding along, and the oxen stumbles, and the cart shifts, and Uzzah is concerned, and he sticks his hand up there to stabilize the ark, puts it perhaps up on the ark itself, and God kills him. Chapter 7, still in Numbers. Verse 6. Moses took the carts and the oxen and gave them to the Levites. 2 carts and 4 oxen he gave to the sons of Gershon according to their service, and 4 carts and 8 oxen he gave to the sons of Merari according to their service, under the authority of Ithamar the son of Aaron the priest. But to the sons of Kohath he gave none, because theirs was the service of the holy things, which they carried on their shoulders. Now that's interesting. The Levites had carts. Lots of people had carts. Moses gave transport devices to all kind of folks, but not for the transport of the worship things of God. They didn't go on a cart. These were to be carried by these designated men. Chapter 10. There's lots of details here we could grab, but I need to pass by most. Just 21st verse. Numbers 10:21. And the Kohathites set out, carrying the holy things. The tabernacle would be prepared for their arrival. And then it describes all the people. So, people are getting ready to move. All of the things for the tabernacle are put together, assembled for transport. The Kohathites come in, and they're the secret service of God. They are the designated transport authority. And they come in and they do the hauling. Well, there's lots of practical aspects. That's all the holy stuff. That's right. All right, back to 1 Chronicles 13. Let's continue. All right, the anger of the Lord is aroused against Uzzah. He struck him dead. He died there. Now notice the response of David in verses 11 to 13. We're going to see at least 2 emotions here. One, David's angry. Then David gets afraid. Well, maybe the order's out of whack. If he had been afraid first, he wouldn't have needed to have gotten angry. But unfortunately, he was not afraid of God. He was not concerned about God's happiness with this event. He is only concerned about himself and what he wants to accomplish. And so, I think that probably David is angry for a couple of reasons. One, he's angry that he's messed up the party. God has just put a real downer into the middle of this party. Here they all are. They're playing their trumpets and their harps and their tambourines and all the stuff, and the people are singing and they're shouting and they're having this grand old time, and then God strikes somebody dead right in the middle of it. Boom. Now that's a party killer right there. Number 2, David's mad about what's taking place with Uzzah. This guy was trying to help you. Here we are trying to haul the stuff, and you strike one of the guys dead who's actually taking care of your stuff, you could find David's anger perhaps here. And we don't know exactly what was bothering David, but this would be reasonable. And there may have been other factors that were going on. I think there is a problem with humanity, and that is we often expect exceptions from God, especially when there's good intent. That somehow good intent is supposed to override bad action. And one of the real differences in philosophy of the political forces in our country, and I don't want to get very far down this path, I'm just going to touch it and move on. One of the real differences in what we would describe as classical liberalism in politics and conservatism is liberalism is often only interested in the look of something rather than in the success of something. As long as you have good intent, you have a good heart, you have good purpose, it doesn't matter whether or not it succeeds. It just matters whether or not you care about it and you do something about it and it feels good. I may be shrifting them, but there's some accuracy there. On the other side, there is sometimes a perceived coldness on the part of those who are conservative because they're not as interested in the look of something or whether or not it's perceived as good. They're often more interested in, will this work? Will this actually accomplish something? Will it do any good? And it's much more practical in its focus. And so here you have this interesting contrast, and the feel-good of this day is blown apart. And now David's having to deal with something else, and that is he has violated God's law and has been reminded of it. He still doesn't know at this point what's gone wrong, just that it's gone wrong. And so he says, I'm not willing to take the ark of God home to my city. God may strike other people dead. So he turns it aside somewhere else and takes his party. They go limping back home like dogs with their tail between their legs. They have had a downer of a day and recover from that. But I need to move on because the clock is ticking. Chapter 15, let's continue our reading and get the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey used to say. David built for himself houses in the city of David, and he prepared a place for the ark of God and pitched a tent for it. It's still in his mind. He hasn't given this up. He wants to do something about it. All right, here he goes. Verse 2. Then David said, no one may carry the ark of God but the Levites, for the Lord has chosen them to carry the ark of God and to minister before him forever. And David gathered all Israel together at Jerusalem to bring up the ark of the Lord to its place, which he had prepared for it. Then David assembled the children of Aaron and the Levites, and we have a whole list here of all of the Levites, and all of the sons of Kohath, many of whom were specifically named. All right, down to verse 11. And David called for Zadok and Abiathar, the priests, and for the Levites, for Uriel, Assioth, and I'm not going to go through all the names. Verse 12. He said to them, you are the heads of the fathers, houses of the Levites. Sanctify yourself, you and your brethren, that you may bring up the ark of the Lord God of Israel to the place I have prepared for it. Verse 13. For because you did not do it the first time, the Lord our God broke out against us, because we did not consult him about the proper order. So the priests and the Levites sanctified themselves to bring up the ark of the Lord God of Israel. And the children of the Levites bore the ark of God on their shoulders by its poles, as Moses had commanded, according to the word of the Lord. Take your pen or your pencil out and mark verse 15. That is one of the most significant verses of the Old Testament. Here is the knowledgeable statement of King David finding out the mistake that he has made. David's a good king. He's one of the few good kings there were over this combined people. And David has found out by the hard way that he was wrong and he doesn't have a special place. This verse gives some very important specific things. They did it. How did they do it? They did it the way the Lord wanted. How do we know the way the Lord wanted? They did it the way the Lord wanted because he said through Moses, and it was written in the Scriptures. That's how. God told them what he wanted to do, and when they did it the right way, what happened? Good things. And when they didn't, what happened? Bad things. Now, what are we supposed to do with this story? There are lots of modern applications, and I hope at some point to come and touch on some of these again. We'll put a peg down here and come back to it. I am certain that in our modern religious world that many churches are far more interested in pleasing themselves than they are in pleasing God. Religious people, quote unquote, religious people, for centuries, for millenniums, since the children of Israel, even those who said they wanted to follow after God are often far more interested in doing whatever it is that they want to do rather than finding out what it is that God wants to do. Now, what's interesting to me is, how did David suddenly come to this knowledge in chapter 15 that he didn't have in chapter 13? Obviously, he's been talking to somebody. He's either been talking to God, and God has explained to him the way more perfectly, or he's been consulting with the Levites, who should have understood, or the priests who had knowledge about these things, or he's gone back to the Scriptures himself. He went back home, and they had a find out what went wrong session. And he called in some executive powers, perhaps, and said, we've got to figure out what we did wrong. And so they did a little research, and they come back, and now David the king understands. We messed up. The reason why God struck him dead is because we messed up. And isn't it interesting that David there takes responsibility for it? And that's one of the beauties of David as a king. He messed up and he accepts responsibility. He says, we didn't do it the right way. God was justified in bringing his vengeance on us. We're going to do it better now. And so they do it the right way. And then everything works out the way they want to be. I think it's interesting that, I can't say most, but I would suspect that many people feel like they are most pleasing to God when they are most pleased. As humans, it's natural for us to assume that if I'm happy, God's happy. And if I'm doing what I like, then God's going to be happy with what I'm doing. And it's perfectly clear that this first group, although they were having a wonderful time, they were not doing what God said. And the fact that they were having a wonderful time doesn't take away from the fact that God was displeased with them. And finally, they crossed the line, and God lowered the boom. Now, the fact that God didn't strike anybody dead up till this point doesn't mean that God's okay with what's going on. It just hasn't crossed the line that was required for the death penalty to be applied. God wasn't happy with it from the beginning. God didn't want the ark moved on a cart. God didn't want the ark moved by people who weren't from the right tribe. This wasn't the way to do it. And eventually they got the message. But people who are religious, they base their satisfaction of God's service on how they feel about it. If I like it, God's happy. And that's as far as they go. They stop right there. And that is a modern problem that's going to continue to be a problem. There are a couple of other passages I want to make reference to. We can't do the study of them I'd like. One is in 1 Samuel chapter 15. In 1 Samuel 15, we have the discussion of God sending Israel against the Amalekites because of the wickedness that they have done. And God is waiting until the time is right for there to be an established king and an established kingdom to be able to take care of this problem that needed to be handled. And so God sends his king Saul to do the business of the judgment of God against this people. And he tells Saul in specific terms, you go against the people of the Amalekites and you wipe them out. This is a punishment. This is the conviction of death placed by God on these people. And Saul and his forces are the the arm of execution to carry it out. The sentence has already been given. If you were a guard in a prison, and your responsibility was to execute criminals or to hold them in position until they were executed. If you were working on the electric chair or lethal injection or whatever else, the person who is actually responsible for putting the person to death has no responsibility to decide whether or not the person ought to die. Now you can imagine someone, how much chaos there would be if we had a modern execution in our time, which people are opposed to anyway for lots of reasons. But imagine the guy, he's got his hand on the switch, you got old Sparky all loaded up, you've got somebody there who's been a rapist, a murderer, a child killer, whatever. He's strapped to the chair, ready to be killed, and the executioner says, "Nah, I'm not going to do it." I just don't know that this guy really needs to be killed. What? That's not your job. That job has already been handled and done. Your job is to pull the trigger. Well, that's where Saul was. It wasn't up to Saul to decide whether or not these people needed to be terminated. God had already decided that. He'd already decided the method. It was already going to be done. Well, he doesn't do it. He keeps the king alive. He keeps the animals alive. They come back home, and he comes up to Samuel and says, "I did what God told me to do." And Samuel says, "What do you mean you did what God told you to do?" "I hear animals. I hear sheep. I hear cattle. I see people. God told you to kill everyone and everything, not to bring a thing back." And Saul says, "Well, the people wanted to bring some stuff back to honor God and to sacrifice, and I thought that'd be okay." No, it's not okay. And you remember the conclusion when it finally gets down to it. And Samuel says to Saul, "Don't you understand?" I'm paraphrasing. "Don't you understand that obedience to God is more important than sacrifice? It's not up to you. It's not up to us to decide what would be pleasing to God. God has already told us what would be pleasing to Him. Our job is to follow it and to do what God has told us." Now that is a very difficult lesson, and modern religious people, as a rule, have not learned it. I wish I had more time. I don't. You're glad I don't. That's good. We'll quit for tonight and continue another evening. Thank you for your time and attention.